Oh yeah, the iconic Sly Cooper trilogy is finally back. Or wait, was it here all along? Did it ever leave in the first place? That seems to be the question some are asking, as this past December, minor headline news, Sony added Sly 2 and Sly 3 to their PS2 Classics lineup on PS4 and PS5, completing the trilogy's presence on the service following Sly 1 being added in the summer. But this thing called the Sly Collection has been available to stream on modern consoles for years now, so what's the deal? Which one of these do you play? If you have the upper tiers of PlayStation's subscription service, PlayStation Plus, then you get both the classic download and the collection streaming for free, so for some it isn't even a matter of price. Turns out, these are not exactly the same. The Sly Collection available to stream is the PS3 HD Remastered Collection released in 2010 by Sanzaru Games, while the Classics versions that were just added are essentially ports of the original PS2 versions of each individual title. Fundamentally, they provide the same experience roughly, but surprisingly there are a number of differences between these two versions of the trilogy, and I've seen enough questions from new and returning players asking which one to check out that I think warrants an in-depth comparison between them. I'll be putting to one side the very real conflict of the Sly Collection's current availability being through streaming, since everyone's mileage will differ on streaming capabilities, so this will be a comparison between the intended Sly Collection experience versus these new classic ports. This way, we can also consider the native versions of the collection available on older platforms too. Before we get started on the comparisons though, I did want to preface this video by stating that this is not intended to be a dunking on of the Sly Collection or the studio that originally brought the trilogy over to PS3, Sanzaru Games. We'll talk a little more about it at the end, but even after this back and forth, I still like the Sly Collection despite its flaws. It's been my personal go-to version of the trilogy since it came out, and since I love these games, that means popping it in the PS3 at least a couple times a year. I didn't even hesitate to purchase a second copy a few years back when my first one started to glitch out and freeze, probably from overuse, and while PS2 HD collections were somewhat commonplace on PS3, the Sly Collection sort of led the pack in a way, and by quite a bit. Despite that, it's maintained its relevancy pretty well over time despite being just a collection, first being ported to Vita and then being one of the first titles on the now-defunct PlayStation Now streaming service. This is all to say that I respect the Sly Collection, and it'll be getting a fair shake as we seek to answer the question, which of these ports is the true definitive way to experience Sly Cooper today? Looking over the graphics and performance first gives us an opportunity to look at how these trilogies were handled as a whole before we dive into the relatively minor content differences game to game. When it comes to graphics specifically, we've got essentially the most significant points in favor of the HD Collection. As the name implies, the HD Collection ups the output to 720p widescreen, making things noticeably crisp compared to the originals, and you can undeniably see more of these games when playing. This isn't just some fake stretch trickery. The PS Classics port is an improvement, but not to HD quality, and you do get negative space on both sides of the screen. While this seems like a clear win for the Sly Collection, the unfortunate truth is that on both of these fronts, the Sly Collection's graphic upgrades do come at some notable cost to the presentation that for some will bring it down from a stark improvement to more of a mixed bag. See, before even getting to the title screen in all three games, players will quickly notice distracting lighting and graphical errors that aren't present in the original releases or in the PS Classic ports. For example, in Sly 1, the opening has Sly silhouetted as he runs across the Paris rooftops. Very fitting, but the HD Collection's improved lighting removes this effect completely, and overall it just comes off as clumsy and less stylish. This obviously isn't a great first impression right out of the gate, but this issue extends far beyond Sly 1, as a similar issue of a character having their hidden and mysterious presentation removed occurs multiple times early in Sly 3 as well, with Dimitri in both the intro mission and in the first Venice mission. There's issues like this all over the trilogy. Giving Sly 2 its turn, it has some elements of the level design that have their presentation worsened. Take these mushrooms that characters can use to get to higher ground. In the PS Classics version, they maintain their original design that blends naturally in the environment, but something clearly got broken when it comes to them in the Sly Collection. Here they exhibit a bright red color that has them standing out like a sore thumb all throughout the level. You can certainly see them better, but you wouldn't say they fit with the environment. Then before you can even start playing Sly 2 and Sly 3, the issues that stem from the widescreen rears its ugly head. While you can certainly see more of the game with the widescreen, some might say it's too much, or at the very least that the implementation was sloppy, as most elements that lay on top of the gameplay were never built with the higher aspect ratio in mind. So here in this case, you can see that the title screens themselves do not stretch far enough. There are so many instances of this that we'd be here forever if we tried to list them all. But to name a few examples that crop up pretty much all the time, we have the pause menu in Sly 3, the first-person camera in Sly 3, including Dimitri's diving sections, and all of the dialogue text boxes across all of Sly 2 and 3. Yikes.
Cool, Daddy-O. How about you take your pimp self down beneath the H2O and get nasty with the scuba? Yo, with bling.
While these sorts of things don't impact the gameplay in any way and can be ignored over time, it is an unfortunate hit to the otherwise stylish presentation these games offer. The same cannot be said for the performance issues though. Now, all versions of these games run at a standard 60 FPS, but there is a pretty major issue with the Sly Collection versions of the games that I feel falls under performance. See, a majority of the game's dialogue is presented via unskippable mission briefings at the start of basically every mission in the game, and sometimes in the middle of them too. The glaring issue is that in the Sly Collection, these often stutter or pause for a second between numerous lines throughout, extending their overall runtime and stilting the natural flow of the dialogue. Here's a comparison on the shorter end of the spectrum, yet is repeatedly noticeable.
I tell you, Bentley, it's gonna be a real pleasure robbing this nightclub.
I share in your enthusiasm, but before we hit the inside, we'll need to do a little reconnaissance work.
What do you have in mind?
I've installed this special antenna on the safe house to help with our first job, hacking into Dimitri's satellite array.
I tell you, Bentley, it's gonna be a real pleasure robbing this nightclub.
I share in your enthusiasm, but before we hit the inside, we'll need to do a little reconnaissance work.
What do you have in mind?
I've installed this special antenna on the safe house to help with our first job, hacking into Dimitri's satellite array.
I can't be for certain what exactly is causing these pauses to happen, but it's incredibly distracting and does slightly lengthen many already long and unavoidable scenes. You might have noticed that the background music was also stuttering and restarting in sync with the dialogue issues to some extent, so something clearly weird is going on behind the scenes. Regardless, one of the best qualities of the Sly games is its snappy character-driven writing, so a hit to the dialogue's presentation is one that is less easy to ignore, and I would hesitate to recommend it at all for new players trying to experience the story for the first time. This is probably the biggest issue working against the collection version in my opinion, as I consider it to be a pretty significant issue, and just as we discussed with the graphical issues, this is another one that is sadly prevalent throughout all three titles. Before we jump into each individual game's differences though, I did want to highlight some other minor animation issues that honestly seem like they could be graphical or performance related. These are often pretty inconsequential, but one I noticed right away when playing the new ports that I found was pretty interesting was in regard to taking pictures. In Sly 2 and Sly 3, Sly will often be tasked with taking recon photos to assist Bentley in preparing setup missions, but look and listen to how different it is in the Sly Collection compared to the original /PS Classics version.
That generator seems to be powering the security systems down here. That generator seems to be powering the security systems down here.
There's so much to unpack with the Sly Collections version. The picture sort of freezes close to the screen instead of going further back like in the original, the sound effect is either heavily distorted or completely different, and the animation where the picture slides off the screen is missing completely. I know, this is quite a small detail, but it's altered in so many ways, I don't know, I guess I just find things like this really interesting. Just me? Anyway, with all that all-encompassing stuff out of the way, we can sort of quickly run through each individual title and compare the differences in actual content, starting with the game that started it all, Sly Cooper and the Thievius Raccoonus. Well, we have a whole trilogy of games to discuss now. Luckily for me, they each only feature a few content differences to go over at most. For Sly Cooper and the Thievius Raccoonus, we first have to talk about the soundtrack. Similar to Kingdom Hearts and its HD collections that would come later, this first game in the Sly Collection, and only the first game, has a completely recomposed soundtrack, often featuring additional instrumentation. Take a listen. For the most part, this is something that will obviously just come down to personal preference track to track, so it isn't something that we can easily weigh towards one version being definitive over the other. I will say that over the years of constantly playing the Sly Collection, I have become accustomed to its version of many tracks, and when playing the Classics version for the first time, I kept waiting for certain pieces to ramp up, only to realize that they never would. That's not to say I prefer all the track changes. When playing on PS5, I noticed this track in Mugshot's Turf that I thought was really memorable and sort of earworm-esque. I started to think, why don't I feel like I've heard this before, like it isn't familiar at all? And of course I got my answer immediately when I checked the remastered track. God, no. that off! One might think that these changes are inconsequential and won't impact the quality of a given playthrough, but somehow that isn't the case. Most infamously, Sly 1 includes a boss fight about halfway through the game that revolves around a rhythm minigame that is synced with the music. Or rather, it's synced with the original music track. The remix, on the other hand, pretty quickly gets out of sync, and so the fight is much more difficult on the Sly Collection. Pretty baffling that this wasn't considered when the track was remastered, but it's no doubt the #1 talking point regarding the updated soundtrack. Our other major difference in Sly 1 to address is one that won't hurt the overall experience, but is less balanced between our two versions. Looking at classic Sly 1, and the original of course, every conventional platforming level in the game features a time trial that can be completed after having already finished a regular run of the level. Doing so boosts your percentage of game completion and rewards with a developer commentary for the level that can be listened to while in it.
So this is the approach leading into Raleigh's Store Machine boat, and this is one of the first levels of the game we made.
These sorts of bonus features that dive into the developer thought processes and motivation are the kind of things that always get me excited in games, especially from this era. The Sly Collection unfortunately removed these though, so besides eventually achieving 100%, there isn't any individual level-to-level reward to get excited about. I don't know how intentional this change was, as I've heard the digital versions of the Sly Collection that released well after the physical actually restored the developer commentaries, so I guess streaming might include them, but as someone who prefers physical and is taking that into consideration, it's something that at the very least had to be addressed. Luckily, overall, nothing too crazy and essential with Sly 1, but overall you are getting a more faithful content experience with the Classics version. Moving on to the sequel, Sly 2 Band of Thieves, while we don't have a whole soundtrack change to discuss, Sly 2 does somehow have even more content differences to go over. For starters, some versions of Sly 2, including the Sly Collection, actually received some minor censorship. It seems that in European territories, a brief scene at the end of Chapter 1's getaway cinematic was cut from the original release of Sly 2 due to its depiction of gambling.
Bentley wanted to try out his new card counting formula, and I figured the team had earned themselves a well-deserved break.
Somehow all versions of the Sly Collection carried over this cut, so in place of the gambling scene we are instead treated to this abrupt ending.
The gang and I headed out of town for a week in Monaco. I figured the team had earned themselves a well-deserved break.
While on the topic of cinematics, there is also the bonus movie situation to go over. The original release of Sly 2 included a number of bonus movies accessible by finishing chapters 1, 3, 5, 7, and 8 respectively. These included a short cartoon, some commercials, and a behind-the-scenes making-of video for the game. However, all but the cartoon were cut from the PS3 remaster.
People have said that I resemble the character that I did the voice for, Bentley, and I guess I can see that.
Maybe the commercials had licensing issues, but why would the making-of video be removed? Sly 3 also has one, but that was left in the PS3 version, so who knows. Both the gambling scene and Boba's movie are thankfully still in the new PS Classics port. Moving on from the cinematic differences to the gameplay differences, we have a couple things to discuss here as well. This first one is sort of a bonus mention as it concerns glitches. Obviously, many remasters and remakes have sought out to fix glitches since their inclusions are never intended. However, the most notorious glitch in Sly 2 allowed you to actually replay some missions, which is otherwise impossible in the game. For context, while Sly 1 and Sly 3 allow for just any old level or mission to be replayed from the menu, Sly 2 has no such feature. The only way to replay a part of the game that you particularly liked is to do a full playthrough back up to its natural point in the story. The glitch that I want to highlight here goes as follows. By running through the sawmill in Chapter 7 again, after finishing the job that's associated with, you could essentially trick the game into putting you back into the mission, and afterwards it would open up the rest of the Chapter 7 missions that follow it, meaning you could actually replay a sizable portion of this chapter. Without this glitch, the only other way to replay, say, the old Grizzleface job or the Lumberjack Games operation, like I mentioned before, is to just replay the whole game from scratch and make your way back here. I always wish the PS3 remaster had added some sort of job replay function, but alas, there is no way, even now. The sawmill exploit was sadly, though understandably, removed from the PS3 version, but like nearly everything else, has been restored in these new ports. Now lastly, we have a surprise addition of all things that made it into the newest port of Sly 2 specifically. It seems that normally these PS Classic ports are meant to represent the originals in every way, but an incredibly useful quality of life feature was somehow added to Sly 2 in particular. As many who have played the games already know, one of the biggest complaints about the Sly games as a whole is the lack of the option to skip cutscenes. Every time you play Sly 2, for instance, whether it be on PS2, 3, Vita, streaming, you will be sitting through every mission briefing, every chapter cinematic, every slideshow, and every in-game cutscene. To my shock and surprise, only this newest release of Sly 2, and again only Sly 2, has enabled a cutscene skip for all manner of scenes. By hitting the start button equivalent, dialogue and cutscenes can now be skipped right over. The only time this doesn't seem to work is in scenes with title cards, like when Murray crashes through the ceiling in Cairo, but even then, right afterwards, you can skip right over the rest of his dialogue. This is a huge game changer, both for casual players and I'd have to assume speedrunning as well. Now, I'm not a speedrunner, so I'm not going to pretend to know definitively, but I can only imagine the chapter times and times for the whole game will be leagues apart compared to when they were unskippable. Even for the casual player, Sly 2 benefits the most from this change, since again, the only way to replay jobs and cutscenes is by doing a whole game replay, so now getting to where you want to experience is much quicker, if still cumbersome overall. I would never have imagined that a random port of Sly 2 would have its cutscene skippable before Final Fantasy X, which seems to get re-released in a more official capacity basically all the time. It's unfortunate that we won't be able to discuss this with Sly 3, since despite them both releasing at the same time, it doesn't appear to have gotten the same treatment, but that doesn't overshadow just how much of an improvement this is for Sly 2, which is also commonly considered the fan favorite out of the trilogy. With this addition though, and several instances of cut censor content being restored, there is no use hiding that this is the definitive way to play Sly 2 going forward. Finishing up though with Sly 3 Honor Among Thieves, this one should be rather quick to cover. Despite featuring maybe the worst graphical errors in the trilogy, content-wise, there's very little to discuss. At first, the only real significant difference that I noticed is that in the original and classic release of Sly 3, some missions will have the option to play in 3D via the use of standard 3D glasses, which was removed in the Sly Collection on account of the whole trilogy having 3D TV support. I've personally never tried the 3D option on PS3, so I really don't have any idea how it works or even if it would work via streaming. I mean, I'd assume so, but one thing I can say is that the Vita version of the Sly Collection, which technically we're covering, that one certainly doesn't feature any options for 3D. Other than that pretty insignificant and likely seldomly used feature, the only other noticeable difference is that, weirdly, in Murray's ball form, the height he can achieve is significantly reduced in the Sly Collection. Pretty lame, obviously, but given how underutilized the ball form is, this is something I didn't even notice until I looked at the wiki page for the Sly Collection's differences. But that's about all that's really worth mentioning when it comes to Sly 3. And seeing as we've discussed everything, right? We can get on with the verdict? Oh yes, of course. Can't forget the Sly minigames. The Sly Collection included a series of little minigames to play with 1 to 4 players from the title screen that were intended to support the PlayStation Move, but can still be played with a controller. Yeah. They obviously aren't anything to write home about, as they're pretty shallow, and Sly 3 already features better multiplayer minigames. You could run through them real quick for some PlayStation trophies, though, and oh yeah. PlayStation trophies. The Sly Collection and the PS Classic Sly Trilogy just so happen to have very different trophy lists to obtain. Now, I'm of the opinion that a great trophy list can elevate a game you already like by pointing a player in the direction of content to engage with that they might otherwise skip or miss. Certainly not every player will place value in the trophies, but for those that do, let's take a quick look. The Sly Collection came first with adding trophies for these games, so they set the standard for how these games could have their activities quantified. Unfortunately, the list for all 3 games leaves much to be desired. These are some of the most effortless platinum trophies you could ever hope to earn, as they don't ask much of the player at all. Each game's platinum can be obtained by simply finishing the game and doing like one other thing. In Sly 1, you also need to get all the clue bottles, which is something. In Sly 2, you just need to buy a handful of gadgets from the shop, and Sly 3 asks you to complete all the optional challenges from the main menu. Sly 1's time trials, though? Nope. Sly 2's safes? Treasures? Nope. There is nothing creative here. Now, I will admit that when the Sly Collection came out, I was thrilled to have some easy platinum trophies to obtain, as before the Sly Collection I couldn't manage to get one from any other game. However, looking back as an adult, I can confirm that these are pretty weak and thoughtless lists. When Sly was announced to be coming to PS Classics, the thing I was anticipating probably the most was actually how they would handle the trophy list, and I'm happy to report that the differences here are night and day. All 3 games require the player to engage with all of its content to earn the platinum, on top of each game featuring creative mini-challenges ranging from beating levels in Sly 1 and 3 under certain conditions, to achieving well-known glitches and Easter eggs in Sly 2. This is honestly incredible stuff and made playing the games again with the trophies in mind an almost fresh experience, which really goes beyond what I would expect from just some randos at Sony putting together lists for 20-year-old games. The new lists aren't especially difficult or anything, but the little additional things they have you looking out for make for some interesting extra challenges to complete, and I'd recommend checking the list out whether you're a trophy hunter or not, especially if you're already familiar with these games like I was. With that though, I do think we finally looked over largely everything separating these 2 sets of ports.
All these memories, they just bring me back to the same place.
Looking back at everything we've gone over and discussed so far about these 2 very different ports of the Sly Trilogy, I don't really think I kept things that ambiguous as far as where I was going with this comparison. From an overall perspective, one collection or the other, I'd have to go with these new PS Classic ports. As much nostalgia as I have for the Sly Collection, I mean, it's been the best and most accessible way to play these games longer than even the originals were, but I just can't recommend it going forward given I've now got easy access to these games with none of the technical errors, and in the case of Sly 2, an all new and highly requested feature. Despite its faults, I really do appreciate the Sly Collection for giving us access to these games for so long. I honestly cut it a lot of slack as a potential definitive edition candidate, considering that I omitted looking at the streaming issues on modern consoles and I neglected to shine a spotlight on how the classic ports include rewinding and save states. I do believe that Sanzaru Games put together the collection undeniably out of love for the games and to prove it to Sucker Punch and Sony that there was still an interest in these titles and even new Sly Cooper games beyond the original trilogy. I don't want to hold all the collection's technical issues against them too harshly, especially when other HD collections, some of which handled in-house, are also wrought with similar problems. I do think though that for me at least, this is farewell to the Sly Collection. At the end of the day, it's far from the end of the world to play a slightly less optimal version of the Sly Trilogy of games. If you haven't played them before, or if you just haven't played them in a good while, I would honestly recommend checking them out again no matter how you can get your hands on them, whether that be on modern consoles, the Sly Collection, or even the PS2 originals. That may seem a little antithetical to the point of the whole video, but this was really to chronicle the differences between two similarly accessible ports and point players in the direction of what is most ideal, but there is no necessarily wrong way to play the Sly games because they're great games no matter what. You might have guessed by this point that I'm a pretty huge fan of all three of these games and consider them to be some of my favorites of all time, and I hope this video has been either informative on which version to play today, or interesting in just looking at all the differences. I'm open to making at least a couple more Sly related videos in the future. One I've thought about a lot recently was to maybe compare Sly 2 and Sly 3 overall, since they're so similar, yet fans that prefer either one are pretty adamant about which one is better. Even as a kid, I was always on the fence because each has its number of pros and cons, but that's for another time. If that sounds interesting, let me know, somehow. Maybe comment which game in the trilogy you like best and why. Yeah, that would be helpful. In the meantime though, I hope you enjoyed the video. Have a great rest of your day, and stay safe out there.